Hello everyone, welcome back to the arcade. So this is the second video in the series. The first video we went over the tools that were being used. In this video I'm going to show you how we're going to manually trace the side profile of the cabinet. I'm following this up with two additional videos. The next video will cover the Einstar 3D and 3D scanning the profile. And then the fourth and final video will be wrapping up how we're tracing the rest of the components. Sit back and enjoy. Alright everyone, this is my donor Pengo cabinet. I picked this up. It has a lot of bad swelling at the bottom of it. Doesn't look too bad in the picture here, but it's about 1.5 inches, 1 3/4 wide in parts with it. So this cabinet, this process is actually about 2.5 hours. I've sped it up at 8 times so that you don't have to sit back and suffer through 2.5 hours of watching this, but should be good enough to get you an idea of what's going on. I've already covered the tools in the previous video, but basically what happens is I have a straight edge, which I'm attaching to the back of the cabinet. This I'm going to basically be using as my x-axis when I'm doing my manual entry into the system. And then I'm going to have a T-square that's going to slide along this edge. So you'll note that this straight edge basically has a 0 point all the way to the left-hand side of your screen. I'm lining that up with the bottom of the cabinet. And basically I'm attaching the straight edge to the back edges of the cabinet. The idea here is that you want the straight edge to remain fixed and not slide as I'm moving the T-square back and forth trying to make measurements. Usually when I try and do this, I try to make sure I have at least 3 to 4 clamps that hold the straight edge on the back of the cabinet. The reason for this is as the T-square moves, I'll wind up having to remove the straight edges as I slide things along, and I don't want to have to lose my zero position with it. So this is basically all just set up. You'll see that I also have my laser tape attached to the T-square, and this is what I'm going to be using for measuring, and then I have the shuttle at the other end. So in the video here, I also have brought up the tracing software. So that's going to be in the smaller screen that you see what's going on. Basically, as I move across, I'm actually kind of doing this a little bit backwards. The axis, you want to think of the x-axis as kind of being flipped. But as I move across, I'm basically going to be manually entering in the coordinates. So the idea is that I start at 0, and then I basically move in increments as I go across. And I move the little shuttle back and forth. I hit the laser light. It gives me a new measurement, and then I record that measurement in. The sheet of paper that you see sitting on the table is basically just easy conversions. I don't have all of the 30 seconds of an inch measurements memorized, and I have to enter everything into the computer as a decimal. So basically the laser tape measures down to a 30 seconds of an inch, and then I'll convert that to a decimal, enter it in, and basically move forward from here. As I'm moving from left to right, or basically the height of the cabinet, that is my x-axis, and the shuttle as it moves back and forth with the laser tape represents my y-axis. So as in most of these cabinets that have rotten bottoms on it, you kind of are doing your best estimates at the bottom for where things actually end up. Usually what I wind up doing is just taking multiple measurements, and then I'll wind up adjusting the measurements in the software afterwards, and I'll go over that in a little bit here. You'll see that I'm moving along rapidly through this straight section. And basically what happens is if I have a very straight section, or it's at least linear as far as movement, I usually wind up measuring every 3, 4, 6 inches, depending on how much motion I have in the cabinet with it. Once I get to the corners and I have a radius, like basically from here all the way through the top of the cabinet, I'm usually measuring every 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch. So this may result in dozens to hundreds of measurements as I go through. So the sharp corner that you see I'm measuring here, these are actually kind of some of the worst corners to measure with it. What happens is as I move the shuttle back and forth with it, there's it's basically a nail that's on the back side with it. It's a little bit less than 1/8 of an inch thick with it. And so the head kind of rides in the slot for the T-molding, which is great. But what happens is that as you go through these sharp corners here with it, it does tend to have the T-square deflect a little bit in the x-axis, so you're not exactly always at 1/4 of an inch. While it measures at 1/4 of an inch on the straight rule on the back, there is a little bit of possible bend to the T-square. So as a result, the real sharp corners, and when you have a lot of motion moving towards the back of the cabinet, is usually your areas where you have your most inconsistencies. So I used to stress about these a lot when I was doing the initial measurements on the cabinets, but I found that it's usually pretty easy to clean them up in the software afterwards. So basically I'll wind up just taking my measurements and continuing to move forward. As a result, some of the measurements, as you see with the cleanup later, when we get to that later in this video, you'll see that some of the points tend to jump around a little bit. And basically what I'm looking to do is try and smooth out the points as best I can across 2 or 3 or 4 points. I'm not necessarily worried about that one outlier that may be off by a little bit. The measuring device that I'm using is a laser tape. This is usually a standard construction laser tape. The device I'm using is a Bosch. I did a lot of did a lot of research on reviews on these when I first got it way back when. From testing it when I finished my basement and a bunch of other tests that I ran beforehand, it was basically accurate within about a 1/16 of an inch across a 20-foot span, which is pretty darn impressive in my mind. It does measure out to a 32nd of an inch, but the accuracy is really seems to be about to a 1/16 of an inch. So just it's something to note as you're doing your measurements. I also have my nail or guide at the end of the shuttle as well. That is just a little bit under 1/8 of an inch wide at the head, which is the biggest point. So that also does introduce a little bit of variation into the measurements as well. So in general, I like to try and think that the measurements are usually between 1/8 and a 1/16 of an inch in accuracy. Obviously your side panels and whatever else are going to be more accurate because they're going to be measured by tape, but anything that's moving like this, like these curves here, I'm trying to keep them with the understanding that I'm within about a 1/16 of an inch of where they really are in reality. So as you can see, if you're following along in the lower picture of what I'm doing on the mapping software, I did make a mistake and fat fingered it, and basically it referenced back to 0, 0. It's not really a big deal. Basically, I'm really only worried about the X and Y coordinate points. So I can basically just continue on with the session. I'll reconnect all the dots afterwards. I've sped up the video here another 2-fold, just to kind of try and wrap up the capture of the side panel. As I said earlier, where I have sweeping motion like here, usually I wind up measuring about every 1/2 of an inch, and you'll see I'm basically moving the shuttle out away from the wood, moving the T-square, and then moving the shuttle back to the point where it makes contact with the wood. The idea for doing this is that I'm not getting any horizontal deflection or pressure on the T-square, which then may cause inaccuracies in the measurements. So at this point in time, I'm about 2 hours into the actual physical measuring of the cabinet, and I'm just kind of basically trying to wrap up the measurements with it. You'll see at the top here as I go around and I move my my clamp here to the other side, I get a little bit quicker with my motion, with my measurements, and you'll actually see this when we compare it to the 3D scans, that this is where I have some variation that I wound up screwing up when I did my measurements. So the moral of the story is to take your time doing it. And as I said earlier, when you have big motion going back towards the back of the cabinet, that's where the T-square has its most problems doing measurements. So you'll see the last couple here with it as I go around the top. You'll find that I actually wind up approaching the cabinet from the other side, meaning instead of moving away from the cabinet and back towards it, I'm moving it more towards the back of the cabinet and then pushing back towards the wood right there to try and get my measurements with it. And that's just basically because of where everything is positioned. Usually here, since I know the top is perfectly flat and there's no curve on it, I'll wind up just taking a couple measurements every couple of inches, or every inch on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, and measuring what the y is. As you see, when I will do the 3D overlay in a little bit, that was probably not the best path to move forward on, but I'll wind up correcting the image when I'm done comparing the 3D scan to the real. All right, everyone, so now we're in the software, and as you can see, I made basically a couple mistakes when I did this, and it captured it really as 3 different objects. I need to combine these 3 vectors essentially into one object. What I'm doing now is I'm basically looking at this as a point cloud data, and as you can see, as it goes left to right, all of the dots are equally spaced. And as I said earlier, it's basically because I'm doing measurements in 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch intervals, and that's why I have such a nice spacing. So first thing I wind up doing is I have to connect the dots and make this all into one giant single vector, which is what I'm doing here. And basically what I'm doing is I'm saying, okay, all the vectors that were selected, if there's a gap that's, 1/4 of an inch or less, or in this case, within a few hundredths or thousandths of an inch, just automatically join them together and make them a single vector. All right. So now what I'm doing is I'm actually smoothing out the measurements that I got from earlier. As I said, occasionally when I do this, I wind up with outliers that may be off by a small amount. When you zoom way in here, it looks like you're off by more than you really are. So when you're looking at your straight sections, it looks pretty good. But you have to realize that the distance between these dots really is a 1/4 of an inch. And then basically what I'm doing is I'm adding in additional points between the dots, and I'm basically trying to smooth out the lines here. You could do this all with curves as well. I find that I prefer almost doing it just with adding additional points and playing connect the dots. It just works out a little bit easier, and I don't wind up with some of the unnatural curves that you get when you're manually manipulating things. Well, it looks like I'm moving these dots a lot. You have to realize that the left to right spacing on these is basically a 1/4 of an inch. And so when I'm moving them up and down, the small fractions, I'm literally moving them, a couple hundredths of an inch in and out to try and smooth things out. And same thing when I'm adding points here with it. So when you zoom way in, it looks like you are making massive changes to the drawings. But the reality is that it's pretty minimal. Once you take into account that the idea is that you're going to be cutting this with a CNC bit that's going to be following a path, the actual deflection here is pretty darn small as a whole. This is additionally reinforced when I actually get the 3D scan up in a future video, and I'll basically show the overlap of the manual scan that I did here with the 3D, and I was actually very impressed with how well everything lined up. And it also illustrated very well how I kind of got a little bit sloppy towards the end with dealing with the top of the cabinet. But that'll be forthcoming in a future video. All right, so that's starting to wrap up here for this video. Just a note, the correction here was also sped up 4 times just to keep things moving along. But the corrections are basically coming together, and we're just about done with the profile on this Pango cabinet. So hopefully this has been beneficial to you, and I'll see you in a future video. Thanks for watching.